Hello? Oh boy. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm Monika Morrow, a senior security consultant at AppSec Consulting, and this is So You Want to Build a Burp plugin. So why would you want to build a Burp plugin? The very first Burp plugin I wrote was just to turn off Interceptor, because who likes doing that all the time? Well, you can do that automatically now. That's a setting. There's been plenty of things over time, and there still are things that are worthy of writing a Burp plugin for. You can write your own scan checks so that you can check for something that Burp doesn't check for that's important to your organization. You can overcome obstacles such as adding signatures and headers that are custom. You can do custom display formatting and trigger alerts, such as one we'll see today. Burp used to have a much more limited API. December of last year, they put out an expanded API that also allows for multiple extensions that can be loaded and unloaded dynamically, which is a huge improvement to your workflow. It was hard for me, even though I loved my Burp plugins that turned off, say, Interceptor by default. You had to load them from the command line at launch time, and you couldn't turn them off. So being able to turn them on and off as you go is a huge benefit. There's now 37 classes in the API that are available for you. You have the original sort of bread and butter of Burp, which is processing your HTTP requests and responses. You also can integrate directly with the cookie jar, add interface items, and there's some helper classes now to parse your requests and responses so that you don't have to do that all by hand. So this is what the Java doc for the API looks like. It's fully Java documented, very easy to go through. That's on Portswigger's website, as well as actually integrated into Burp at this point. So let's get started. I think that a programmer with very little experience can, after they have at least seen these, and the source code will be available for these, can modify these to do something that's worthwhile for them, they'll help their workflow or overcome an obstacle for a test that might otherwise have to be manually done. So today I'm going to use NetBeans, which ships with Java JDK 1725, together with this empty extension that's provided by Portswigger that saves you from having to do all the Java prerequisites to get going. Even if you don't know how to do Java code, get NetBeans, install it, open this project, you're off, you're ready to go. So the first one I'm going to show you today is a find and replace of the proxy traffic. This is a plugin. It's going to examine every request to the proxy tool only, and it's going to look for a keyword. In this case, the keyword's replace me. And if it finds that, we're going to replace it with a dynamic value, which is going to be the time in milliseconds, which is something that Burp doesn't do out of the box. You can do a find and replace for a static value, but it doesn't out of the box do one for a dynamic value. So for every one of these, our system prep is going to be this setup you see right here. We're going to unzip the empty extension project into a specifically named folder. You'll see why in a minute. And then we're going to go through NetBeans and open that. So you can see that every single one of my projects here in NetBeans is named Burp Extender, which is sort of a side effect of Java and the projects, meaning the class has to be named the same thing as what you want it to eventually be named. So that's why it's so important to name that outside folder. So you can see in the other side here, the find and replace is shown up there so you know you're opening the right thing. So once you get Burp Extender, you're going to extend this tree until you get to this file, which is the only one we care about. It's the only one we're going to change the code. Everything else is the API. And so if you open that file, this is the code that you're given to get started. And while this will compile, and you could try and load it, it's not going to be very exciting at all. But if we just add this one line of code to name it, then we can compile it. Hopefully it's successful at this point. And we can load it. You can see that, again, we have the tree here going on. It'll be in the dist folder. And then we get a nice, it was loaded successfully message, and we can see that we have a list that will populate as we add more extensions. And it's named for us. So we're going to go ahead and add some more code to this to make it more functional. We're going to import a print writer at the top of our file. We're going to make some private member variables to save. You can see here there's some windows inside of Burp for output and error. We're going to go ahead and save those off so we can use them later in the program. So registering HTTP listener is the most important thing we're doing here that's actually super Burp related. So by calling this, we're telling Burp that we're overriding process HTTP message, and it should call it every time a message is sent or received by Burp. In turn, when Burp calls this for us, it will pass us a tool flag, which is either proxy, scanner, interceptor, whatever the tool happens to be, and whether it's a request or a response. And then this object that contains tons of information about it, including the entire request, and if it's a response, the request and response. So at this point, if in process HTTP message, we just add one line to print out to that saved off standard out, if we make one request, which has a response, you're going to see here that we get 2 printed messages in our output file. So in this instance, we're going to request that only the tool flag proxy be acted upon, and only if the message is a request. And then we're going to write our own custom function so that we don't muddy up our Burp function there. And it's going to take the message info, and it's going to return the message info so that Burp can then pass that on and actually use it. And so to maintain the contract with our new function, we're going to return the message info. And so now we can go back to our the process HTTP message function and actually call our function that we just defined. Now, when you get the request from the message info, it's a byte array, and we don't want to work with that, so we're going to turn that into a string. And now we're just writing basic Java code. You could, whatever your problem is, you can Google Stack Overflow, you can find an answer at this point. But so we're going to define a string replace me, and we're going to define our dynamic string, the current time in milliseconds to return, and then we're going to create a new string of the proper length. We're going to take out the old stuff and put in the new length and create that new string. Now we're going to do some I/O that's going to throw an error. So again, we can, in our catch, we can use our standard error and print that out pretty easily. And so then here's your standard sort of Stack Overflow answer for how do I replace a string with another string. And so this just goes through line by line. If it finds it, it does a search replace. And it adds back in all the new lines it takes out by doing it line by line. And so then all that's left to do is set the new string. We need to convert it back all the way down to a byte array, and that'll get passed to Burp, and then Burp will actually be able to do all this. So I wrote a PHP test page, hello world. It takes world in the name here, and it returns world. And if you say hello BayThreat, it says hello BayThreat. But if you say hello replace me, it gives you back your timestamp. But if you send this to repeater, since we told it we only want it to act on proxy, it's going to say hello replace me. It's not going to act on that particular message. So my second project I have to show, this one's actually my favorite. I use this one all the time. It adds a menu to the proxy history. So it's going to check each message that comes through so you're going to select in the proxy history some of the messages that you want to scan. You've selected these, I need to scan these. And instead of saying scan, send a scanner, you're going to select my menu option. It's going to check and see if each one of those is in scope. If it's not, it's going to ask you if you want to add it. If you choose not to add it, it's going to not do anything with it. But if you choose to add it, it'll add the actual domain, so you don't have to do it over and over. And then it will send it to the scanner. And then it will actually mark it visually 2 ways in the proxy history so that you know you've already done those. So the same setup, you're going to take that empty extension, you're going to unzip it and open that up. Again, you're going to name it. This time we're going to name it add menu. Before, the only thing we did with callbacks was do the add menu. We're going to do something else with it later, so we're going to save that off to a private member variable so we can use it later. And this time, instead of registering an HTTP listener, we're going to register a context menu factory, which is going to notify us with the create menu items function every single time a right-click menu needs to be generated. So this is going to generate a menu on the fly for us. So the create menu item requires a couple of things that aren't imported by default, so we're going to import those. It's going to require this array list of JMenu items to be returned. So we'll do this to maintain that contract. We're past an invocation that we're going to need to use, so we're also going to store that away for later. So just like we were able to choose that we were going to use the proxy before, there's lots of places in Burp you can right-click and get a different context menu. So we need to know which one we're acting with. So today we're going to use the proxy history, the content proxy history. We're going to name our new JMenu item, mark and scan, and we're going to add it to the menu, assuming that this is the context we're in. We don't want to add it to something that doesn't make sense. Adding a action listener, because now we need to know when they've actually clicked on our menu. So when that menu is clicked, this new action listener will be called, and if the mark and scan happen to be the selected option, then we can put our code here to be acted upon. So again, we're going to write our own custom function. This one's mark and scan, and it gets to take an array of messages so that you can actually work on your whole selected list. And we need this because the invocation, we needed to make this the member variable invocation because otherwise we can't call it from here to get those selected messages to call it. So for each of the messages in our array, we're going to, again, another try block because we need to create a URL which throws an exception if something goes wrong. We're going to, again, since this time we didn't, this is another way of doing it, we didn't save off standard error, we can do it right here in line. We have all the things we need to do that. We have M callbacks. So we have to create a URL to check scope, but once we have this URL, checking scope is a one-line operation. You're going to get your protocol, your host, your port, and I'm choosing to ignore the last bit, which is the rest of the URL, because I actually want to only add the domain to scope. So this is your one line. If it's not in scope, pass the URL. Hey, Burp will tell you in one line if that's in scope or not. So if it's not in scope, you can, with basically one line again, you can show a dialog box in Java. Hey, do you want to add this item to scope? And if so, we can go ahead and actually include that in scope, again with one line in Burp. And so now that we've potentially added it, maybe it wasn't in scope before, but we've added it, we have to ask again if it's in scope. And then we can, with this one line, pretty much the same as creating our URL, we can do an active scan. We can send this to Burp Scanner. The additional information here is the actual request message itself. And so then my favorite trick here, this is the visual part that I love. I can set the highlight to pink because I don't use that for other things. And I can actually set a comment that I sent it to the scanner. So if we see what this looks like here, I've selected two different requests. I've selected mark and scan. Hey, this item isn't in scope. Would you like to add it? Well, in fact, I would. And then we get these nice highlights so that I can very visually see that these were indeed scanned. And if I go to scope, I can see that it added the entire domain to my scope. And so you can see that it actually did send those two items to scope. I apparently have a problem with one of those. So my final demo here is scan alert, which is something someone else asked for me to write once upon a time. So this plugin monitors the status of the scanner, and it alerts the user with sound and alert box when no scanning activity has taken place for over 30 seconds. I chose this value because the SQLi, some of the tests have a wait 20 seconds, and so I gave it some lag in there, some extra wiggle room for network lag and stuff to make sure it was actually done scanning. So you're going to do the same unzipping as before. Going to set the name, scan alert. And we're going to have a private variable just to store the time. What was the last time that the scanner was called? We're going to, again, register an HTTP listener. And we're going to overwrite process HTTP message, same as before. So now we're going to see if it's the scanner instead of the proxy, and if it's a request. And we're just going to store the time. Now we have to implement a timer, because this is event-driven programming. We don't have anything to call us all the time. We have to write our own timer, because if you don't have other traffic, there's nothing to drive your check. So I wrote my timer to go every 5 seconds. It doesn't need to go any more often than that. It's not a super important function. And it's going to automatically call this run function every 5 seconds. So here's my check that I'm going to put in the timer. If the scan time is greater than 0, meaning that the scanner is running, I'm going to check the current time versus the last recorded scan time. If that's greater than 30 seconds, then let's go ahead. There's one-line function. I love these Java one-line functions that will beep the speaker for you. And you can, again, pop up with one line of code a dialog box. And at this point, since we don't believe the scanner is running anymore, we can set the scan time back to 0. So when your scanner is finished, you'll get this lovely scanner is finished dialog box. I don't have a ding in my PowerPoint slides. So at this point, I can show a live demo. We can actually see all these. So here's Burp and Firefox. I have no extensions loaded, but I can go ahead. I'll show you that my scope is empty. It's in the dist folder by default. That was successful. Add menu. Successful. Successful. So if I do the live demo of basically what's in the slides, I can do hello world. Let's do this with index. And hello BayThreat. Hello replace me. If I refresh this, you get new timestamps. But if I send this to repeater, you just get replace me because we told it we didn't want it to do that. And if I didn't want to use this plugin anymore, it's that easy to unload it. And turn it off. And so then, if I mark and scan, I have another domain here. So now I have some different pages to scan. So now I have 3 different domains here, but I have 4 things selected. So it should ask me 3 times when I go through mark and scan. BayThreat at port 80. BayThreat 443. An alternate demo 443. And there's a little GUI hiccup with Burp, but as soon as you go away and come back, it'll update. So we know which ones we've sent. They'll say sent to scanner. And we can see that all 4 were sent and they finished. So if we're patient, we'll get a pop-up box. Are there any questions? Yes. There it is. So I believe your question is there a way to overwrite certain checks that the scanner does so that they aren't reported? Is that your question?
To change their logic or something like that, yeah.
My tack would probably be to write one that addresses what you want, and that Burp has recently put out some new features that let you turn up and down the thoroughness and stuff so that you can change some of those false positive returns. But there is an API, I haven't looked very deeply into it, where you can be notified every single time a scan item is found, and you could then at that point deal with it. So if you know programmatically somehow that something is a false positive, you should be able to mark it a false positive at that point. I believe the API is that thorough at this point. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Disadvantages in developing plugins in different languages like Python or Ruby? Is everything exposed in Java, same in those languages?
Okay, so the question is there a disadvantage to writing in Python or some of the other languages that this is available in? Yeah. There isn't. I was a C++ developer by trade before I came over to do this, and so I'm more comfortable with Java. But I do see that there are a lot of people writing in Python and stuff, and Portswigger has made those languages fully accessible to the entire API.
I loaded an older extension once that was written in Ruby. I believe it complained that it's like deprecated or something. Has that changed?
The older extension you loaded that claimed it was deprecated was probably...
Because it was written in Ruby, it didn't support it.
Okay, so the question is, Burp claimed an extension you tried to load was written in Ruby was deprecated. So, well, I think probably what the problem was is it was something that was written before December 2012. You run into stuff a lot of times. If I'm looking for documentation or, oh, I want to do this thing, but has somebody else already done it? Can I leverage somebody else's work? I find that I have to make sure it's past that December 2012 point. Or you have to use Burp 1.4 instead of 1.5. So you could use that, but you'd have to use a version of Burp 1.4. Any other questions? Does anybody want to see the code? Like, all put together? The code. The question was, will the code be available? The code is available right now. You can go get the code on my GitHub. Monika Morrow, make sure you spell my name right. BayThreat 4. If there's no more questions, I can give you some of your day back. All right, thank you very much.